Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Soul Focused Radio. This is your host, Martin Friedman.
And I'm your host, Cindy.
And I'm your host, Martina.
Beautiful. Here we are back again, the three of us. This is exciting. How are you both doing right now?
I'm doing really well. The kids are on summer break, so I've got to sleep in a little bit in the mornings, which has been really nice. And we've been having a lot of fun with each other, just spending time with all three of the kiddos, because usually one is always in school longer than the other. So it's been nice.
Yeah, and I've been doing good too. Martin, I know you always try to not talk about the weather, but we've had some sunshine and summer finally came over here. So I got to just mention I've been enjoying the sunshine. How about you, Martin? How have you been?
I'm good. But I have to say, it's really a prohibition for like me and my D because we're old men, and it's like all we talk about was location and weather. So you're allowed to talk about weather, especially living in the Puget Sound area. You get to talk about weather because it's a big deal there. I'm good. I just came off, some pretty significant time on the road. Really, the last like 3 months, I've been on the road a lot. Helping my mom out and now traveling a little bit for work. I'm being on the West Coast for about 10 or 11 days. And it took a little toll on me physically, but overall I'm good. And, just dealing with life and trying to remain emotionally sober. That's pretty much everything for me right now.
Way to loop it back. But I hope your body is healing well from all those travels.
Thank you. Yes, everything is good. And I do, since I looped it back, we got one of the tricks of the trade here is the segue, right? So let's segue into, before we get into today's episode, which was awesome. I just wanted to see if you all had any thoughts from last time. What's kind of come up for you over the last little bit of time. Maybe Cindy, let's start with you because I know you weren't able to be on the conversation with us with Dustin today. So what's come up for you since our last conversation in part 1 about emotional sobriety?
A lot has come up for me, actually. Last week when we recorded, that was like the first time I had really been introduced to the concept of emotional sobriety and emotional intoxication. And now that I'm aware of that concept, I am more conscious of it. And, to be completely honest, I feel like some days I'm emotionally sober and some days I'm still stuck in my emotionally intoxicated ways. And so now that I've been more conscious of it, that's a goal of mine to get emotionally sober. Right. Because I feel like I'm kind of in between. So, there's a couple more questions that I wanted to touch base with you regarding our last conversation. But that's the goal now, is to be emotionally sober.
Absolutely. And it's pretty wild, right? Because this is something that really wasn't, in your consciousness, wasn't really on your radar up until we had the conversation. I mean, I think you said you'd heard the term, before, but now it's something that, once you hear it, I always make that analogy, like when you get a new car and you see your brand of car on the road everywhere. And it was just as much on the road before, but now you see it. And it sounds like that's what's going on with you and the concept of emotional intoxication and the concept of emotional sobriety.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And that's good. I mean, that's good because it's opening up doors. So I'm excited and can't wait to have a conversation with you later on during your segment about your thoughts around this. And then Martina, how about you?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about, we had a conversation with Dustin today, and I feel like last week sort of introduced me to the idea, like Cindy was saying, to emotional sobriety, and we got a good overview. And I'm really looking forward to this week, sharing our conversation with Dustin, where I feel like we started to peel back some of the layers of the onion to understand a little bit more depth of what emotional sobriety means and what it looks like, and what it looks like to be emotionally intoxicated. Because I think recognizing that in myself when I'm in a state of emotional intoxication is just as important for me to then sort of bring my mind to a place of, okay, I need to move towards that emotional sobriety.
Yeah. I mean, that was a really good conversation today. And I'm excited for our listeners to hear it. Cindy, I'm excited for you to hear it. because I think Dustin lays out some pathways for emotional sobriety. So, how to get there and how to recognize when you're triggered. So I'm excited for you to hear it for the first time, and I'm excited for our listeners to hear it.
Yeah, I'm super excited as well.
Well, let's get to it, you all. And in the meantime, please subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform you're listening to us right now. If you're on YouTube, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit all those good buttons that all those people tell you to hit all the time, and share this. Share this on your social media. Share this with your friends. We're growing our community. We're growing our family. We see you as our family, and we're going to be more and more interactive moving forward. So yeah, let's build this community. We're excited to have you part of what we do. And with that being said, let's go. All right. Well, right now it is with extreme pleasure that I introduce our Chief Operating Officer and Senior Consultant, Dustin Washington, to get in on this conversation around emotional sobriety. Dustin, how you doing?
I'm really good, man. It's good to be with you too.
Yeah, it's great to have you, Dustin.
Thank you, Martina. I'm super excited about this conversation. The topic is something that I think about all day long, every day. So I'm super excited to share with you all.
Awesome. Well, let's just jump in. I mean, I know you listened to our first podcast, so we kind of got it going with my story and my perspective. But yeah, we just really want to hear from you. What's your story? What's your perspective? What's your understanding of emotional sobriety?
Yeah, in terms of my story, emotional sobriety as a concept was something that I wasn't familiar with at all. The vast majority of my life. It wouldn't be until I engaged with 12-step recovery, specifically after, of course, my initial foray into 12-step recovery was through Alcoholics Anonymous. And then I was introduced to Adult Children of Alcoholics by Hank Azaria. And it would be through that process that I really began to experience emotional sobriety in an active way. In AA, we talk about emotional sobriety, but from my point of view, there's a different perspective and depth around it in ACA. I've been thinking of just like, how would I define emotional sobriety? Because if you say that to the average person, most people don't have a sense of what that means. But I really think about it as being having healthy, mature, adult expression of our emotions and a unity of our emotions, our thinking, our actions, our soul, all acting as one. And emotional sobriety just really provides that ability to access all of who we are.
Wow, that's beautiful. Something that you said, Dustin, really had me thinking, I think for a lot of us, emotional sobriety might be a new concept. But for those of us who are maybe familiar with it, you kind of mentioned how it wasn't till you were with ACA that it became more of an active part of your life. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what that difference felt like and looked like, and in what ways does ACA support you to, reaching this more active emotional sobriety, where, I was really struck. You said you think about it all day, every day. So that's a really powerful thing for me.
Right. So much of my recovery journey initially was about looking at how I caused harm because of my alcoholism to other people. But through ACA, it's calls you to take a deep walk back into your childhood and the messages that you received growing up from your family, from society overall, and how those messages became part of our subconscious programming. And not to necessarily go back and cast any blame on anyone, right? Because I did years and years of therapy, and so much of my focus, I don't know if this was because of the therapist or not, but I think this was probably more because of me. So much of my focus was really casting myself as a victim. All these awful things were done to me in childhood. So of course I'm showing up like I am. But through ACA, it's going back to look at the messages that we downloaded into our subconscious programming or our groundwater, as we would say in the Soul Focus group, and then beginning to look at how do these messages show up in me. And so emotional sobriety for me, as I think about emotional sobriety every day, is because I saw myself constantly in this cycle of being reactionary to old triggers, old wounds that would be, come up in my relationships now. And I really start to see myself and really see the vast majority of us as being wounded children walking around in adult bodies, taking on adult responsibilities, playing adult roles, but really fundamentally showing up as hurt children who just want to be loved. And so for me, in my desire to experience more of myself and to show up as my biggest self, my most beautiful self, the most beautiful expression of myself, I really became committed to looking at what are my triggers? What have I been reacting to in my life from those old places like I just talked about? And how do I start to soothe and reparent that inner child so I can begin to show up with the full range of emotional expression? And so, Martina, one of the things my partner will often ask me is, like I'll be triggered by something, I'll react. And my typical reaction is from a place of anger. And she will say, tell me how you feel, though. And I'm like, well, I'm angry. And she don't know, but how do you really feel? And it would be so hard for me to access what the feelings underneath that anger would be. And as I've grown through studying myself, exploring myself, I've come to understand so much of it was fear, hurt, feelings of possibly fear of being rejected, and being able to share those underlying feelings in a vulnerable way is something really, really new to me. But as I do it, it starts to dispel and break down some of those old wounds and triggers in a way that makes me feel healthier in my expression. And, just the other thing I would say, definitely been thinking a lot about masculinity and the messages that I internalize as a man and that we internalize as men collectively, and just seeing how far we are as men from being able to access and tap into and share the depth of the feeling that we have in this world. And so, again, that burning desire that I have to experience all of myself in this lifetime, so much of that is rooted in the pursuit and seeking of emotional sobriety.
Wow. I feel like that's something I can definitely relate to. And I imagine a lot of folks can, of like, so often we respond with anger when there's something underlying, some other emotion. And I feel like what you said is like fear from, whatever has happened to us in the past that makes us use anger as a defense mechanism. Is there a certain practice? You talked a lot about introspection and reflection about yourself, but are there certain practices you found really helpful for you to start really uncovering kind of what's in your groundwater? And then my second question is, because, we talk with Cindy about being a parent, and you have three boys, but 2 little ones, and I have a little one. Of how is now kind of in this journey of emotional sobriety, how is that affecting the way you parent?
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow, those are great questions. In terms of the first question around the practice, one of the most useful practices that I have found is the ability to give myself a time out when I see and feel myself going into that inner child place. And when I first started to practice it, it would be kind of a petulant timeout. Like, I just need a fucking break from whatever this is, or whoever the person is. It's the understanding that something is coming up in me where I feel off-centered. And for me, if it feels familiar, or we have a saying, it feels hysterical, it's historical, meaning there's touching on some deep-rooted pain within me, that I know I need to step back and breathe and really feel what's going on and begin to ask myself a series of questions. What's familiar here? What is really true? What is really happening? What am I really feeling? And how do I express what I'm really feeling from a vulnerable and honest place with the other person that I might be triggered with, or with myself, so I can get to a place of having some sort of honest discourse. And also just the practice of reparenting ourselves, really being able to go in and consciously talk to the wounded child, and soothe the wounded child, and love and nurture and let the inner child know you're protected, you're safe. You're not that, 5-year-old child, little boy, scared in New Jersey anymore. You're an adult who has everything that you need to protect yourself, to nurture yourself and care for yourself. In terms of parenting, I get to go back to New Jersey a lot and be with my family. And, I would go back over the years and get triggered by everything that I would see and cast a lot of judgment on my family. One of the things that I'm doing now is going back almost in a research mode, of course, in a loving mode and being with them and caring about them, but also going to look at the habits and patterns that I see in them so I can see them in myself that I'm playing out unconsciously right now. And I go back and I see some stuff and I'm like, whoa, I do that. And that is not how I want to show up in the world. And so as a parent, I feel like my job, my most important job is because our kids learn from not what we say, but what we do and the frequency and energy and vibrations we're creating around them every day. And so my most important job is to heal that stuff in me, recognize it, seek to replace it with some new habits, and then practice those new habits so they can in turn see the full expression of what's possible in terms of emotional health. And so my kids are like my greatest teachers. They teach me so much about being emotionally present. And I feel like my job in turn is to show them a whole different way than I was shown in terms of expression of feelings and being okay with our emotions, being confident with our emotions, and being able to share what we're feeling vulnerably with each other. So that's just really trying to do the work on self so I can affect them and their groundwater, because they're like your daughter, they're at such a critical age. The 0 to 7 time is so critical in terms of what we do as a parent. And so to the degree in which we do our work, we prepare them for a healthier emotional life than we had.
That's beautiful, Dustin. And I love too the language you used of like the timeout to connect with our inner child. To me, that just really resonates, and just like a beautiful mirror of how we think, like give kids a timeout to think about what they're feeling. We absolutely need that.
Mm-hmm. And Martina, so many of us were taught, so I feel something and it's easy for me to say, you, Martina, are making me feel this. Mm-hmm. But the adult in us needs to be able to understand that, no, I am feeling this. I'm responsible for this feeling. And this feeling is all about me, right? And that's not to say that people don't cross over boundaries that they shouldn't cross, right? But, emotional sobriety for most of us growing up, I'll say for me, I know like the notion of boundaries was something that was foreign. Like, what does that mean? There were no boundaries in my family growing up. I had no model for boundaries, no models for boundaries in my community. And so, being able to establish healthy boundaries with other people, but most importantly for ourselves. And, this world teaches us to be a victim. Our socialization collectively is to be victimized. But when we start to get connected to our power, we understand that everything that we're experiencing, everything that we're feeling is really about what's going on with us, and taking that level of responsibility for what I'm experiencing in my life.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Dustin, because I really wanted you to speak, if you could even expand on that more, right? Because how much of emotional sobriety has to do with us centering ourselves. I'm thinking about the ACA Serenity Prayer, that asks us to accept the people we cannot change and the courage to change the one we can, and knowing that one is us. And as you and Martina have been talking, I've been really reflecting on how much emotional sobriety is about not trying to change other people, but about focusing on ourselves. And I know from, you and I talking, multiple times every day, and a lot of times, this is a subject that comes up, that still can be very challenging.
Oh, yeah.
A very challenging concept.
Yeah, definitely. So I know I'm in emotional intoxication when I am trying to control other people. And I grew up in a family where control was as normal as drinking water. I mean, control was just the in the air that we breathe. And so I spent a lot of my life trying to make other people be what I thought I needed them to be so I would feel good about myself. And having that energy, I've created and attracted, very familiar relationships to my childhood. There's a term, Martin, that me and you were introduced to, 15 years ago, called trauma mastery, where we recreate familiar situations to try to correct the root trauma through control that we're never able to correct. And so part of that moving out of a victim stage, Martin, is understanding the concept of trauma mastery, seeing how we're engaged in it, and knowing that every single thing that we are experiencing, within our external world and our relationships in our lives is because of what's going on in our internal world. There's an ancient saying, as above, so below, or we could say as within, so without. And what that teaches is that our external world and all the relationships that we're having, experiencing, or reflective of what's going on in our inner world. And so for me, it's been so important to have fellow travelers like you and Madi and Hank and so many other people that really help push me when I'm having blind spots, when I'm emotionally intoxicated, to push me lovingly back to self-reflection. And so it's so important to know that even though we've been socialized into this rugged individualism, this journey to emotional sobriety is not something you can do alone. It's very important to have fellow travelers who can see what you can't see and love you back to a centered place within yourself.
That's awesome. So I think for me, I really have just one question left. I don't know, Martina, if you have any other thoughts or questions for Dustin. I'm really interested in, what would you say to other people? I know Martina hit on this a little bit already about sort of the steps that you take. And I think I'm most interested in, what would you say to people about how easy it is to get into a place of emotional intoxication when triggered, and how hard it is to get to a place of emotional sobriety in those triggered moments. So what would you say to people? I know taking a time out is really cool and everything, but when we're super triggered, it's hard to oh, this is the time I have to take a time out, So what would you say to our listeners about how to transition from emotional intoxication to emotional sobriety?
Like anything, it's got to be a practice, right? And it's got to be something that you continuously work at. And the first thing is to recognize whenever you're feeling off center, that should be a red flag that there's something going on within your inner world, within your emotional life, that is not grounded, that is not stable. And again, that has to be coupled with with the understanding that we are not victims. And we have to learn to stop pointing the finger outward and become introspective of what's going on with us. I recently read something that if you want to know what's in your inner child, what's in your subconscious programming, what's in your groundwater, just look at your life and your relationships. Whatever's not working well for you will show you the program that's in your inner child, the faulty belief system that's in your subconscious programming. So if you're constantly getting into arguments with your lover, there's something that's not working within your program. Now you have a choice. You can continue to blame the other person, or know there's something going on with you. If you're constantly having failed relationships, if you're constantly not achieving what you want to in terms of your physical health, if you're struggling with finances, if you're not achieving what you want to professionally, there's something going on within the program of your inner child that is driving you to those places over and over. And what's beautiful about how our consciousness works is that until we get the lesson, we keep getting these experiences over and over and over, not for the sake of punishment, for the opportunity to get it. And so what I would say to people, if you keep experiencing the same triggers over and over, it's really acting as a mirror to show what is going on within your program. And then once you get to grab onto some of that and recognize the faulty program, which is the number one key for growth, recognition, then you have a opportunity, an option, a choice to replace that program with something that serves you. Now, consciously, we can't just replace something. Behavioral modification doesn't work. What we have to do is repeat it till it becomes a new habit, a new program in our subconscious programming. So again, Martin, I think the most important thing maybe I could say today is that it's important that you engage with other people who are on the same journey, having fellow travelers who are truly seeking emotional sobriety, because they've been some places that maybe you haven't been, and they have some lessons to share. But also folks outside of ourselves can see what we can't see when we're in that intoxicated place. And so being able to develop trusting, loving, honest relationships built in accountability in the most beautiful sense, accountability that we don't want to hold you accountable and check you, but we want to see you be your most beautiful self. If you can create relationships like that, there's an opportunity to do some amazing growth.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that what you're speaking to is like we threw the word accountability around a lot for decades,
Yeah.
but you're talking about a whole other level of accountability when you're in vulnerable, truth-telling relationships with people like that, like you and I are. And you mentioned my D, you mentioned Hank. Certainly, it's true for me with Felicia, my wife, my daughter Maya, from this marriage. So yeah, I think it really resonates with me what you're saying.
Yeah, and Martina, this work is so important for our society. I mean, again, we live in a nation, a society with, I'd say 98% of folks that are making policy decisions, that are leading healthcare organizations, that are teaching children, that are policing communities, all the critical positions. We have little hurt children in adult bodies. And we can see what we're producing as a society, how far away we are collectively from emotional sobriety. So this individual work we're talking about is really a practice of self-solidarity. And as Martina, as you get more in solidarity with yourself and more in touch with what it means to be emotionally sober, and Martin, as you get more in touch with what it means to be emotionally sober and in solidarity with yourself, and I do, then we're able to create some collective solidarity, or what we would call as human solidarity. And then we can start to create and build something together from a place of our most beautiful selves. But right now, most of us are acting out from our hurt, wounded selves. And there's an addiction to that. And it's an addiction no different than an addiction that I had to alcohol, gambling, sex. Some people have had porn addictions, shopping, food, all that stuff. This notion of being a victim is addictive as well. And this is keeping us stuck as a collective, as a human family.
Thank you.
This is a beautiful conversation. I'm honored to be a part of it.
Dustin, what really resonated with me, Martin, you mentioned the word accountability, is I think so often, at least how I interpret that word, is like as a negative thing and punishment. Like, I'm going to hold you accountable. And Dustin, that way you reframed that was really beautiful to me, is I'm going to hold you accountable to be the beautiful person that you are. It's such a loving, it's such a growth. Like, the picture that comes to my mind is like a flower blooming, versus the other accountability is like just smushing everything down. And I feel like that is that mindset that we need to make that change in our society, the way we are with our kids. I think a lot about healthcare and the way that we train our healthcare providers. It's so much of the finger pointing accountability instead of let me help you grow accountability, seeing you for who you are and the beauty you hold.
That's right. And Martina, we think about your beautiful little girl. I think about my beautiful boys. We see that all of us are born beautiful, and something happens along the way that distorts our natural expression of who we are. And so those of us who are moving into a deeper state of emotional sobriety, a deeper state of being so focused, it is our job to see people not for who they are showing up, with their program right now, their ego, their inner child, right? We should know that because of the socialization of this world, the vast majority of folks that we're interacting with, we're not interacting with their natural expression, their authentic self, their higher self. We're interacting with their program. And if we can see that, we should be able to see beyond what they're showing us today back to the beautiful little children that we have and who they were, and understanding what was done to all of us to show up in such distorted ways from our natural expression. Because, I think about, I was a beautiful child. I was a sweet, loving, gentle, beautiful child. And painful things happened along the way that took me off of my path. And now my work, your work, Martin's work is about going backwards so we can go forward in a much more powerful way together.
Thank you, Dustin.
Thank you.
And it fits with, what we talk about with healing. We're not going to be able to heal collectively till we heal individually. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and the energy. Your thoughts and your comments and the energy that you brought has been really beautiful.
Yeah, appreciate you both.
Thank you so much, Dustin.
Thank you.
Creating is the new way of fighting. At the Soul Focus Group, we're doing something radical, people. Instead of fighting against racism, sexism, and classism, which are all designed to keep us apart, we are bringing people back together again. Want to know how? By creating human solidarity. In doing so, we're improving productivity, increasing effectiveness, and transforming the way people communicate. Essentially, we're healing broken relationships. Let us bring our Creating Human Solidarity 2-day workshop to your business or organization. Sign up for this 2-day in-person workshop at thesoulfocusgroup.com, because it's time we come together.
Hello again, and welcome to Martina's segment on healthcare and emotional sobriety is what we're going to talk about this week. Hi, Martin.
Hey, Martina, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. I'm excited to talk with you about emotional sobriety and what that looks like in healthcare, or doesn't look like in healthcare, I should say.
Nice. I'm excited to hear your perspective on this. I really am.
Yeah, so what I was really hoping to talk with us about is something that came up when we were talking last week about emotional sobriety with you and Cindy. And we talked about how part of emotional intoxication is not letting us feel our feelings all the way through. So we kind of have an initial feeling and then we just stop and we get stalled right there. And it really resonated with me in the field of healthcare for a lot of practitioners because of our time constraints. And I think because of our culture in medicine, the way we can have some really intense emotions and we don't take time to process them. So I've been thinking a lot about how, when we're working in the hospital or even in clinic, we can hear some really intense news. So we can have a patient we're taking care of. Sometimes where I work now, a lot of the patients I know from clinic. So I've known them for a while and they're in the hospital. They might code. So they essentially they stop breathing and their heart stops, and we do CPR to try to resuscitate them. And oftentimes that doesn't work. And unfortunately, our patient transitions, they pass away. And, sometimes we only have 5 minutes to process that before we go back to working. And it's just like thinking about what an intense way to really show, like moving us into a state of emotional intoxication where we have experienced something so intensely, like the end of somebody's life, and we only spend 5 minutes maybe to process it, and then we have to just switch our brains back to work mode.
Wow, that's really heavy, right? So, I think I'm interested in two things. If you could maybe speak on, like, how do you see emotional intoxication play out in, doctors and physicians in general? And then specifically, how do you feel emotional intoxication play out for you?
Yeah, those are great questions, Martin. I think emotional intoxication, it really starts almost even in med school where there's this grind, grind, grind mentality. And it's almost like pride. And the harder you work, the less you sleep, the better doctor you are, which is so not true, because when you're sleep deprived, we know it's like you're intoxicated with alcohol. So that's not how I want my physician to be. And then often that culture continues in residency. So we're training up a whole group of people to just not really ever have the time or think it's right to take the time to take care of themselves and to process the intensity of what we often do. And so, we are talking about this earlier. We see amongst physicians a high rate of suicide, depression, substance use disorders. And I think that's how it's playing out. And I think now even burnout, especially with COVID, we're seeing a lot of physicians and healthcare providers move away from direct care with patients because people are just emotionally burnt out and quitting the field. And so we have a shortage of providers. And so it's definitely affecting our healthcare system. And I see that, where I work, we're down 4 doctors. And so many of my friends where they work, they're also down providers. So it's months for patients to get in to even see a provider. And so that's really taking a toll on our community's health. For me, I grew up in that space of the grind of med school and residency. And I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's something like a third of, maybe even 50% of interns, so first year residents, are clinically depressed. And I know for me as a resident, and I went to a residency that really valued wellness, but I really suffered with depression and mental health during residency. in some ways just sleep deprivation, but a lot of it was just the responsibility of what we were expected to do, and kind of like this expectation to heal people, to save people, or to make them happy. And sometimes what people want isn't what is recommended, whether it's a certain medicine or a certain test. And so how do you manage those expectations, and never really having the training of how do I process these emotions? Like, I think what was taught to me was it's healthy if you can not care when you get a patient complaint, of almost just be like, okay, and then move on, because it's going to weigh on you too much. But there was never training of, well, you should feel through this emotion, and why are you responding so strongly to this situation, and what does that have to do with your groundwater and how you've grown up? Because of course we're being triggered, and I've been triggered by things, and I'm definitely a people pleaser. That's part of the work, I've been doing with Madi and understanding ego, is I try to please other people. And that's really hard as a doctor, because I'm seeing, 15, 20 patients a day, and people are going to be unhappy. And that's part of what I do. And why am I such a people pleaser? What does that have to do with my groundwater? And then it affects me for so long. Like, I'm really upset if a patient is not happy with my care for like days to weeks, and it affects me really deeply. And I think that's me being in some ways emotionally intoxicated, like not actually being able to process. And then, we talk about accountability. Okay, in some ways, the patient is accountable for what they feel. And I need to understand that's part of their disease process and their journey. But then why do I hold on to it for so long that it affects my mental health, my relationships with my family, with my friends? And so that's something I'm definitely still working on a daily basis, of balancing compassion and then understanding, okay, why am I reacting to the way this person reacted to me? I don't know if that's making sense.
It makes huge sense, actually. I mean, I just appreciate you, being honest about that. I really do, because that's pretty heavy, what you're talking about. I think, you mentioned what it feels like to have to, as you put it, code someone, right? And then take 5 minutes and then see your next patient or go on to the next thing. The vast majority of people listening right now have never experienced that, will never experience that. So what does that feel like? Just what does that feel like to have to go through that experience and deal with that?
Oof, yeah. Luckily, it's not something that I experience a lot. I'm going to say that first and foremost. But there's for me so many layers of emotions. I think first and foremost is often sadness, because a code it's not a peaceful way to pass. And so I think there's, I believe really strongly in valuing a peaceful and a beautiful passing. And that looks different for everyone. And, we only code people who choose that. So that is part of their choice. But family isn't by your side during that process. And it's just very medical, very procedural. And so that I always feel sad about that, because I think for me, at least, it would be not the way that I would want to pass. And then, of course, there's sadness about the end of someone's life, and the sadness for the family, and the sadness of breaking that news. I think the unhealthy emotion that I feel then after that, and I really try to work on with our residents to not feel this, is guilt. I think in medicine, we're always, especially in the US, and I think this is why our healthcare costs are so high, is we're always trying to prolong life as much as possible. I think we have less of a focus often on quality of life. And so I think my mentality is sort of on the subconscious level, how do I keep someone alive and keep someone alive and keep someone alive? And when someone passes, I didn't do my job. But, as we know, every moment of life, we're moving closer to the end of our life. And it's a reality we will all face, the end of our lives. And so it has to happen. And I think, hopefully there wasn't a mistake that was made. And so we shouldn't feel guilt. We should feel this was a transition that was going to happen. And hopefully we can feel a sense of calm that that the family and the patient were aware and that this is what the patient wanted, us to try to keep them alive no matter what. So I think that those are like the first two really big emotions that I feel, and I try to give spaces. But I think working with the residents actually really helps me take more time because I'm worried about their wellness. So I really try to make sure that they take more time to process and to talk through things and to talk through those emotions. I'm definitely a crier, but I try not to cry. And I don't know why we have that. I don't know how you would feel if you saw a doctor cry, but I feel like I've been taught like we're not supposed to cry in front of our patients. So I usually keep my tears for home or like the bathroom later by myself. And I think that's healthy for me to just release. And then if it's a patient that I've known well, I always like to check in with the family like a week or so later, just give them a call and also just share sort of the honor that it was to care for their loved one. Because it is something that people trust us with, and that is an honor, and I recognize that. So that's part of my processing, I think, like a week or two later, is to thank the family and to check in with them.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I mean, I know we gotta wrap on this segment. I have actually a lot of questions, and a lot of thoughts. And I think a couple of things I just want to say. I think one of the things that's so special about having you on the podcast and sharing this is most of us don't get to have these type of vulnerable conversations with people in the medical profession because of that wall, where you're not supposed to show certain kinds of emotions. I'm going through a lot of stuff with my mom. She's over 90 now, and she's dealing with a lot of health issues. So I'm getting to experience a wide range of doctors and nurse practitioners and nurses and technicians. And yeah, it is really fascinating. I don't know. You asked an amazing question. I don't know how I'd feel if a doctor cried like in front of me if somebody passed. I mean, I think one of the things you really have me thinking about, and maybe we can, close your segment out here on this, is what does emotional sobriety look like in the healthcare profession? Because, as we talked about before, crying is not necessarily a sign of emotional intoxication. In fact, if it's, appropriate, I mean, certainly it could be, but if it's appropriate, it's actually emotional sobriety because you're working something through and you're getting to the other side. So maybe if we were more emotionally sober and healthier as a society with our expectations of the medical field, because you are, what I hear you saying, maybe without using the word, is that if you do have a relationship with someone who passes, there is also grieving for you. And we never think about a doctor grieving a patient's loss.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. Because I guess I think about it because I experience it. So that's kind of mind-blowing to me. I never thought about that. But it makes sense. I mean, the family's going through their own grieving process. Why would you think about the doctor?
Yeah, and maybe I'm off base on this. It's just one person talking, but I've never thought about, I never really thought about that doctors or caretakers would really grieve because of that wall, because we don't see you cry, because we don't, ever hear a doctor say, well, this is, I'm really sad for myself because I really grew. I don't know. Maybe that does happen. And I don't know. I haven't had a lot of experience with it, but that's my general impression, is that we don't really conceptualize you all really grieving the loss because of keeping that professional, quote unquote, demeanor, which is an emotionally distant demeanor for the most part.
Right. Yeah. But to go to your question of what does emotional sobriety look like in healthcare and for our healthcare providers, I think it's so multifaceted, and I'll try to keep it brief. I think a big thing, that I share that I experience as emotional intoxication is this desire to please other people, which keeps me from feeling my own emotions and like doing the deeper work of, well, why am I such a people pleaser? Because it's impossible to please everybody. And if I did everything to please people, I would probably lose my license in some cases. So I think one for me is reframing our expectations as a society on what a healthcare provider is supposed to do. And I think in our society, so often we are expecting healthcare providers to have the answer, So the answer lies outside of us instead of within us. And I think a lot about, Chinese medicine and acupuncture, and there's more of an awareness that the solution lies within me. So if you, talk to a lot of the, Chinese elders who practice Chinese medicine as part of their lifestyle, they take that responsibility of, well, I haven't been eating right. I haven't been exercising right. So I know this is why I have this illness. And so there's more of that internal awareness. And I think as a society, we've lost that. We turn to pills and studies as our way to find health. That is sometimes the answer, but often not. And so I think that puts an undue amount of pressure on physicians and healthcare providers. And then I think many of us take that on, which is why we feel that guilt maybe when somebody passes of like, I am supposed to be almost like God and keep you alive for as long as possible, without really having the tools to do that. And again, that's our job, is to walk with people and share information and accompany people on their journey towards health. So I think that is, to me, the biggest framework mentality that has to change. And then we'll feel less pressure, which will give healthcare providers more time to actually process and to be with people, not expecting to be perfect. Saying, okay, I'm going to accompany you on this journey. I don't have to get all your metrics right, where your blood pressure, your blood sugars, your cholesterol are all at this right number. So I'm seen as a quote unquote good doctor, because there's a lot of those pressures too, at least in primary care, which is where I work. And then I think changing the culture of how we train physicians. And it's something I'm trying to work on where I am, is that working harder doesn't make me a better doctor. And I'll tell a quick story. At work the other day, we have our new interns just starting, and they were joking how, like, personal hygiene is important. Make sure you take time to take a shower, because sometimes, and I experienced that, like taking a shower is like those 5 minutes I don't have. So sometimes personal hygiene falls to the wayside as a resident. And there were like jokes, like maybe we can like subtly give a bar of soap to the resident, da da da. And in my head, I was like, well, this is like a red flag. This person is not doing well if they don't have time to shower. And so instead of pushing them harder and punishing them or making a joke about it, like that means that they need a day off. And that's what should happen. If someone comes and they're like, well, you haven't showered and you smell, you probably need a day off to do some personal care. And I think switching that mentality, which is hard because we talk about like, that's in the groundwater of doctors, is like, well, I went through it, you should too. And that absolutely has to change.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, this is such a powerful conversation. And, let's keep the conversation going, in your segments, because I think this is something that is just, like I say, it's a glimpse that most of us don't get. And there's a level of humanity that often, which is crazy, is often missing from medicine. I also want to say too that, a lot of what you're saying reminds me of the social justice work I did. It reminds me of the social work, I did for 20 plus years, where we push ourselves and we grind and we hold our struggle as being the sign that we're good at what we do and that we're down, So I think the fact that your medicine, I think, has a little bit of a different intensity to it, but it's really making me think that a lot of the quote unquote helping professions, have a real similar ideology about pushing through, et cetera.
Oh, no, exactly. I think you're right on. I feel the same with like social workers and definitely social justice work. It's like, if you struggle, then you've made it. And I mean, that's why we have Soul Focus Group, right?
Exactly. That's why we have Soul Focus Group.
And so I think, like definitely want to continue this conversation. And I think, my sort of last thoughts are, folks who are having to interact with the healthcare field is, yes, we need to hold our providers accountable, because there's a lot of messed up stuff that happens in medicine, and there's so much racism that affects our care. And I really encourage folks to, like, we need to start looking within for our health. Pills can only do so much. And so that's something I'd love to talk more with folks about. How do we start to do that? And how do we start using the medical profession as less of a crutch and more of a tool?
I agree.
Now you've given me a lot to think about, Martin. I appreciate it.
Well, you gave me a lot to think about. I mean, that was awesome. It was an awesome segment. I appreciate you having me on your segment today, Martina.
Thanks for coming on. Thank you all for joining in on Martina's segment. We're still working on a name, so feel free to send in suggestions, and we'll talk with you all next week. Be well.
When it comes to racism, the truth is most people are only reporting on the problem. They're not solving the problem. At the Human Solidarity Project, we are doing something to solve the problem. Through our Sending the Right Signal workshop, we are teaching organizations and businesses how to move beyond DEI work. Next, we are teaching organizations how to heal from the damage caused by racism. And finally, we're showing organizations how to create cultural integration and truly bring people together. Sign up for these 3 virtual workshops today at soulfocusgroup.com. Your organization will never be the same.
Hey everyone, it's your host, Cindy Edwards, and I am joined by Martin and Martina. And today we'll be speaking about emotional sobriety and how it correlates to parenting. Hi, Martin and Martina.
This is exciting. It's exciting. I'm excited to hear your take on it. I know you've been putting a lot of thought and energy into this, and I'm chuckling because Martin and Martina are just one letter apart. So we're going to be answering for each other probably a lot.
It's true.
Yeah. So, following up from like our last conversation, I've been doing a lot of reflection. And, as mentioned before, I feel like some days I feel emotionally sober. And then there are moments where I am emotionally intoxicated. And, I've come to realize that because, emotional sobriety is like the journey. That's the end goal that I want to be at. And so, I've come to realize that emotional sobriety it's all about progress and not perfection. Because since I was talking about it last time and me noticing it in my parenting style in my day to day, there are some days where when I have my emotional intoxication moment, I start to feel a little bit guilty about it. And, I know guilt is like part of our second mind, not our first mind. And I wanted to hear your guys' thoughts, or if you guys have any questions for me and, around emotional sobriety and parenting.
Yeah, well,
Go ahead, Martina. Martina, you go first.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you, asking us and having put the thought around emotional sobriety and parenting. And like you were saying, that desire for perfection that's rooted in our ego. So I really appreciate you saying that it's a journey. I think for me, and you'll hear this when you hear our conversation with Dustin this morning, he talks a lot about emotional intoxication being rooted in the groundwater that came from his childhood, and like reactions that are based out of experiences from childhood. And so, a question I had for him is, well, how are you parenting differently now that you have this awareness of emotional sobriety? And I'm curious for you too, Cindy. I know it's not been maybe as long that you've been working around emotional sobriety, but what are some ways in which you think that your parenting style has and will change so that way you can foster emotional sobriety in your kiddos?
Oh, that's a great question. For the most part, I'd say when there are moments that I feel triggered, for me, it's important for me to slow down in that moment because my lifestyle, I'm so on the go, right? It's always, picking up the kids and then taking them to an after school activity, picking them up, taking them home, cooking dinner and then bathing them. So I'm constantly doing stuff on top of, having a messy house. And so I just feel like sometimes I get overly stimulated. And so, having 3 young kiddos, they tend to fight a lot. And I've learned that when I'm not able to slow down and like I'm reacting in that moment emotionally. So, say like when my children are fighting with each other and they're screaming and yelling and crying, I feel myself getting overly stimulated. And when I'm emotionally intoxicated in that moment, I say something that I don't mean, right? I'm like, you guys, please, like, just stop. You guys are driving me nuts. But like in reality, like that's far from the truth, right? Like those are my babies and I love them so much. But because I'm not emotionally sober in that moment, I'm overstimulated and tired, I react instead of taking the time to slow down and to just pause and like reflect on how I want to respond to this situation. So I think, just since learning about this concept or being more aware of emotional sobriety, I've really taken the time to just like, slow down instead of going from 0 to 10. I'm like, I'm trying to live in like the 4, 5, the 3, 4, 5 range. So I think for me, just slowing down and reflecting to see how you can respond in a healthier way for everyone, right? Because when I don't slow down and I react, I say things and then, I end up hurting my kids' feelings. And then, the shame and the guilt kicks in and it's just like a really toxic cycle.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Cindy. I think listening, one of the things that really stands out to me is one of the things that I've learned, and Hank is my sponsor, talks to me about this a lot. Like, it's okay to feel a feeling in the moment, but a lot of times when we were children, like we weren't allowed to see that feeling to completion. You know how we talked about the difference between emotions and feeling last time. Instead of the feeling being healthy and we can see it to completion, it gets stuck in an emotional place. And so like being upset, being angry, being a little bit like short tempered, being a little overwhelmed, being a little of those things, like given, what I know of your life, I think that's very reasonable. Where I think it becomes emotional intoxication is when you don't feel that feeling all the way through and then get to the next thing. You know what I'm saying? So like, oh, there's a lot going on right now. I'm trying to bathe 2 kids and the other one's screaming or whatever, right? And so I'm feeling a lot of frustration right now, but being able to take a pause and, Dustin's, talking about that in our segment as well today, but being able to take a little pause, a little time out. You may not be able to take a time out while you're bathing your kids, but even just like 2 deep breaths and just say, okay, this is a frustrating moment. And, the way I'm going to deal with it is I'm going to deal with it by doubling down on being compassionate or doubling down on being patient. So I think one of the things that I've learned is like, I have a problem with anger. My wife said, please stop being angry with me, or expressing anger to me. And what I realized is I could still feel the anger, but I had to stop expressing it to her the way that I was because it was not healthy and it was very triggering for her. And so I had to learn new ways to express it. But that doesn't mean that I still wasn't angry for that moment. I just was able to, work that feeling through and not allow it to become a repetitive motion.
Yeah. And, this brings me back to our very first conversation, right? Like the power of the mind, right? So like when you're having a tough moment, just taking time to restructure your thoughts, like, okay, Cindy, take a breather, or step out of the room or whatever you need to do to get you back to that compassionate, patient, loving parent that you are. So I just thought that was interesting. It made me think about our first conversation around the power of the mind.
What that makes me think about is we talked with Dustin about accountability and not reframing it from punishment as how I've always thought about accountability versus accountability to being the best, who you are, that wonderful, loving parent. And so that what you just said really resonated with me and brought me back to what Dustin said about making time to even hold ourselves accountable, but not in a punishing way, which again kind of moves from that idea of perfection and being rooted in the ego.
Yeah. And I think that's the punishing part, Martina, is like when that guilt and shame comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of stuff like if like Cindy, if we weren't taught as children how to be healthy with these different emotions and feelings, we're going to attach that negativity. And that's when the whole like critical inner parent comes in. Then we start to be like harsh with ourselves, maybe the way our parents were with us. And then we start to perpetuate like guilt and shame on us. And that exactly feels to me like the loop that you were talking about.
Yeah, and that's something that I've been, you know, more conscious about is just giving myself more grace. Because I think it is pretty common with a lot of my fellow mom friends where they constantly bring up, that at the end of the night, like they reflect on their day and they feel guilt and they feel shame and they wish they would have responded in a different way. And it's like this toxic cycle that we continue to put ourselves in. So definitely something to be more mindful about and work towards, and just trusting the process.
So maybe one tool or one skill that you can start to practice, and we can check in on you on this moving forward in our other podcast episodes, even though we'll be talking about different things, is maybe start to really put in that pause, like a 2 or 3 beat pause, or like a 1 deep breath or 2 deep breath pauses when you start to feel that, and see if you can shift your energy a little bit so that later on you don't get to that place of guilt and shame. It's just an offering, but it's something that maybe you could see if you can start to integrate into your parenting practice, and then share it with us moving forward.
I appreciate that a lot, Martin. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you so much, Martin and Martina, for joining me in this conversation around emotional sobriety and parenting. I really appreciate, you guys holding space for me to share, my current parenting journey. And Martin, I really appreciate, your offering of taking a pause, or, incorporating pauses into my day, especially in moments where I'm starting to feel triggered. That's something that, I find will be really beneficial for me.
Awesome. And I appreciate you. I appreciate your vulnerability, your honesty, and how like serious you're taking all this, like how much you want to grow. And I think it's going to be fascinating to be on this journey with you.
Yeah, Cindy, I really want to thank you. Something that Dustin said today is it's being on the journey towards emotional sobriety. It's so important to have people like as passengers with you on that journey. And so I really appreciate you being kind of one of the passengers with me while I'm on the journey and all that you share. So I'm always looking forward to our next conversation and checking in with you on those pauses.
Awesome. And, thank you to our listeners. I hope you enjoyed this segment around emotional sobriety and parenting. And we'll talk to you next week.
Well, that was another awesome episode, you all. I love the segments. I love the conversation with Dustin. I love the rapport we are building together, the three of us. And yeah, I thought it was another great episode.
I mean, like I've been saying, these just feel like conversations with friends. And so I'm really appreciating having this time to connect with you all and get to know you better, and hopefully, in the future, connect more with our listeners too.
I always look forward to our recordings because I just love how rich our conversations are. And, I'm just really excited to continue this journey with both you, Martin and Martina, and our listeners and our guests that we'll be having on, because, these conversations are so deep and so rich. And yeah, I just really enjoy it.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for being on this journey with us. And I want to thank each and every one of our listeners for being on this journey with us. This is a journey of growth, a journey of love. No, we love each and every one of you. And we're so excited to have you a part of what we do. So go to soulfocusgroup.com. Subscribe to us on all your podcast platforms, on YouTube, and be a part of what we're doing. We're getting back on the road again. And we want to see you one way or another, either virtually or we want to see you in person. Can't wait to continue the work that we do together. So you'll be hearing about new and exciting offerings every week that you tune in, and we can't wait to see you next week. So we ask that everybody stay safe, stay well, and most of all, what do we want them to do, team? Stay so focused. That was getting better.